My name is Fabian, 35 years old, and working as an investment banker in Boston. Despite my success, my family has always found a way to label me as difficult. I've maintained a complicated relationship with them, walking on eggshells while simultaneously funding their comfortable lifestyle. Last week, my mother called with news that shattered me. "You're not invited to Thanksgiving this year, Fabian. You're just too difficult." What she didn't realize was that her words would trigger consequences she never anticipated. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever had to stand up to family who took you for granted. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Hartford, Connecticut, where appearances mattered more than reality. Our colonial-style house with its white picket fence projected an image of suburban perfection that masked the dysfunction within our four walls. My mother Margaret ruled our household with critical precision. She was the kind of woman who noticed when a fork was placed 1 inch off center at the dinner table and wouldn't hesitate to point it out. She wore her auburn hair in the same neat bob for 30 years and dressed in pressed slacks and sensible sweaters, maintaining control of her appearance just as she tried to control everything else. My father Howard complemented her controlling nature with his passivity. A tall man with stooped shoulders that seemed to physically represent his surrender to my mother's dominance, he worked as an accountant at a local firm. He wasn't a bad father. He attended my baseball games and taught me to change a tire, but he never contradicted my mother. His usual response to any family conflict was to retreat to his garage workshop, where he built intricate model ships that would never sail. Then there was my sister Heather. 3 years younger than me, she quickly learned to navigate our mother's temperament by becoming her mirror image. She adopted the same judgmental head tilt, the same disapproving purse of lips. She became the golden child who could do no wrong, while I became the designated troublemaker. My earliest memory of being labeled difficult came when I was 7 years old. During a family dinner, I questioned why I had to eat Brussels sprouts when my father didn't have any on his plate. "Because you're a child, and need to learn respect," my mother said. "Stop being so difficult." That word stuck to me like gum on a shoe, impossible to shake off, no matter how hard I tried. Throughout elementary school, I excelled academically, but struggled socially, always second-guessing myself in interactions. Was I being too questioning? Too intense? Too difficult? Middle school brought more of the same with added tensions at home. By high school, I had developed a coping mechanism, excelling in every possible area to prove my worth. I maintained a 4.0 GPA, captained the debate team, and worked weekends at the local hardware store, saving every penny for what I saw as my eventual escape. College came with a full academic scholarship to Boston University. My parents attended my high school graduation, but seemed more relieved that I was leaving than proud of my achievements. "Try not to overwhelm your professors with your questions," my mother advised, as I packed my car. My father handed me $200 and a pat on the shoulder. Heather didn't bother to say goodbye, busy with her own graduation party planning, though she was only a sophomore. Those college years were transformative. Away from the constant criticism, I discovered that what my family called difficult, others called analytical or thoughtful. My economics professors appreciated my detailed questions. My roommates enjoyed our late-night philosophical discussions. For the first time, I found a community that valued the very traits my family had conditioned me to suppress. After graduation, I landed an entry-level position at a financial firm in Boston. The early years were grueling 60-hour weeks, endless coffee runs, and a salary that barely covered my studio apartment and student loan payments. I never asked my parents for help, though they called whenever they faced unexpected expenses: a leaky roof, a faulty furnace, Heather's spring break trip to Cancun. By my late 20s, hard work had paid off. I was promoted to senior analyst, then investment manager. My salary increased exponentially, and I moved into a spacious downtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. My parents suddenly became interested in my career, asking pointed questions about my income and investments during their infrequent visits. The pattern established itself subtly at first. My father called about refinancing their mortgage after a downturn in his firm's business. "Just temporary," he assured me. I offered to help setting up automatic payments from my account. Then came their utilities, property taxes, and eventually supplemental credit cards for emergencies. These emergencies included my mother's kitchen renovation and my father's fishing boat hardly necessities. Meanwhile, family gatherings became exercises in restraint. I'd fly home for holidays bearing expensive gifts and checks for their accounts, only to endure underhanded comments about my cold profession or uptight personality. If I mentioned a promotion, my mother would change the subject to Heather's latest achievement, usually something trivial like redecorating her apartment or dating someone new. The most recent Thanksgiving had been particularly tense. I'd arrived with a gourmet turkey and fine wine, prepared to cook the entire meal since my mother claimed her arthritis was acting up. Halfway through dinner preparation, she hovered behind me criticizing everything from how I chopped onions to the amount of salt I used. When I gently suggested she might enjoy relaxing while I finished cooking, she stormed off claiming I had kicked her out of her own kitchen. The dinner that followed was frigid, with Heather glaring at me across the table for upsetting Mom, while my father silently carved the turkey I had paid for and prepared. Despite all this, I maintained the financial support. My therapist called it a subconscious attempt to buy the approval I'd never receive, and perhaps she was right. By my 35th birthday, I was covering their $3,000 monthly mortgage, all utilities averaging $500 monthly property tax installments, and supplementing their retirement with another $1,000 each month. I wasn't their son anymore, I was their bank. The week before this Thanksgiving, tensions escalated when my mother called to complain about the landscaping service I'd arranged for their yard. They didn't trim the hedges the way I like. She said, though, I was paying $400 monthly for the service. When I suggested she speak directly with the landscapers, she accused me of dismissing her concerns. My father called later to say, I should have just listened without trying to solve the problem, his standard response to my mother's grievances. Little did I know, these minor squabbles were just the prelude to what would happen next. The phone call came on a Monday evening, just 10 days before Thanksgiving. I had just returned to my apartment after a 14-hour workday, loosening my tie and kicking off my shoes when my phone lit up with my mother's name. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Our last conversation about the landscapers had been draining, but guilt compelled me to answer. Hello, Mother, I said, trying to inject warmth into my voice despite my exhaustion. Fabian, she replied, her tone clipped in that way that always made my stomach tighten. I need to discuss Thanksgiving arrangements with you. I assumed she wanted to coordinate my arrival time or ask me to bring something specific for the meal. I reached for a notepad, ready to jot down her requests. I've been thinking about our holiday plans, she continued, without waiting for my response. Heather is bringing her new boyfriend, Jason. He's a pediatric surgeon, you know. The pointed emphasis on his profession was typical, a subtle dig at my own career, which she'd never fully respected, despite the financial security it provided her. That's nice, I said neutrally. I look forward to meeting him. There was a pause, then, Actually, Fabian, that's what I'm calling about. Your father and I think it might be best if you didn't join us this year. The words hung in the air so unexpected that for a moment I thought I'd misheard her. I'm sorry. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, she sighed, as though I was the one creating a problem. Jason is very important to Heather, and we want to make a good impression. You can be so intense. Your questioning and your opinions, the way you always have to analyze everything. It's exhausting for everyone, Fabian. My hand gripped the phone tighter. You're uninviting me from Thanksgiving dinner. We're just suggesting a break this year, she continued, her voice taking on the falsely sweet tone she used when delivering her cruelest comments. You're too difficult, Fabian. You always have been. Remember last year with the kitchen incident, and Jason shouldn't have to deal with your intensity the first time he meets the family. I sat down heavily on my couch, suddenly unable to stand. I see. I knew you'd understand, she said, mistaking my shock for acceptance. Maybe next year, once Jason is more established in the family. Heather really likes this one. The conversation ended shortly after, with my mother reminding me that the property tax installment was due the following week, as if she hadn't just excluded me from a family holiday. I sat in my silent apartment afterward, phone still in hand, replaying her words. You're too difficult. You always have been. Outside my window, Boston's skyline glittered indifferently. I could see my reflection in the glass, a successful man in an expensive suit alone in a luxury apartment funding the Thanksgiving dinner he'd just been told not to attend. The next hour passed in a fog as I processed the rejection. I showered mechanically, made a sandwich I couldn't taste, and scrolled through emails without registering their content. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Your mother means well. She just wants a peaceful holiday. You know how she gets when she's stressed." His message only deepened the hurt. Not only would he not stand up for me, but he was also complicit in my exclusion while expecting my financial support to continue uninterrupted. Heather texted an hour later, "Mom told me about Thanksgiving. Don't take it personally. Jason's really important to me, and first impressions matter. I'm sure you understand. By the way, can you still send that check for my car insurance this month?" The audacity was breathtaking. In the same message where she endorsed my exclusion from a family holiday, my sister still expected financial assistance. I placed my phone face down without responding and walked to my window staring out at the city below. Memories of previous holidays flooded back, bringing expensive wine that went unappreciated, cooking meals where every effort was criticized, listening to Heather's achievements being celebrated while mine were minimized. Last Christmas, I'd gifted my parents a weekend at a luxury resort in Vermont. My mother had examined the gift certificate and remarked, I hope the rooms aren't too small." I'd spent $5,000 on the package. I thought back to therapy sessions, where Dr. Lisa Goldstein had gently suggested that my family's treatment constituted emotional abuse. I defended them, then making excuses about generational differences and communication styles. But being explicitly uninvited from Thanksgiving dinner, while still being expected to fund it, crossed a line that even I couldn't rationalize away. My phone buzzed again, a series of messages from my mother listing grocery items she needed for Thanksgiving, and reminding me that their heating bill was higher this month due to the early cold snap. The disconnect was staggering. I was simultaneously too difficult to tolerate at dinner, but reliable enough to foot the bill for it. For a brief moment, I considered my usual response, swallowing the hurt, sending the money, and spending Thanksgiving alone with takeout and Netflix. It was the path of least resistance, the pattern established over years of conditioning. I'd be the bigger person, the reliable son, the family bank that asked for nothing in return. But something had shifted. The blatant unfairness of it all crystallized in that moment as I stared at my mother's grocery list, and I realized with startling clarity that this pattern would never end unless I ended it. No amount of financial support would ever buy their respect or genuine inclusion. No achievement would ever be enough to overcome being labeled difficult. I looked at my reflection again in the window glass, but this time I saw something different, not just a successful man, but a man who had allowed himself to be exploited by the very people who should have valued him most. A man who funded the comfort of people who couldn't bear his presence at their dinner table. That was the moment I decided things had to change. The realization that I needed to act settled over me like a weight and a release simultaneously. I moved to my home office, a space I'd meticulously designed with mahogany shelves and a view of the harbor. Ironically, a room that symbolized the success my family benefited from, but never truly acknowledged. I powered up my laptop and opened a spreadsheet I'd created years ago to track my parents' expenses. The numbers were stark. $3,250 monthly for their mortgage, $476 for utilities averaged across the year, $1,200 for their retirement supplement, $600 for their property taxes spread monthly, and roughly $2,000 in credit card emergencies that had become routine rather than exceptional. All told, I was transferring nearly $7,500 monthly to support their lifestyle. $7,500 each month to people who had just deemed me too unpleasant to tolerate for a single Thanksgiving dinner. The financial analyst in me took over detaching emotion from facts, as I'd been trained to do. I pulled up my bank statements documenting exactly which accounts were in my name alone and which were joint. I checked the mortgage arrangement I'd established legally. I wasn't a co-owner of their home, merely the person paying for it. The utilities were in my name for ease of payment. The credit cards were supplemental cards on my accounts, authorized for their use, but ultimately, my responsibility. What I found was both disturbing and empowering. I had been enabling their treatment of me but I also had the power to stop it. An ethical struggle ensued as I stared at the glowing screen. Would cutting them off financially make me the villain they already thought I was? Would it confirm their view of me as difficult and selfish? More importantly, was it the right thing to do? They were in their 60s, not elderly, but certainly past their peak earning years. My father's accounting practice had downsized, and my mother had never worked outside the home. I closed my laptop without making any decisions, and called the one person whose judgment I trusted implicitly, my friend Marcus, who had witnessed the family dynamic firsthand during a disastrous weekend visit 3 years earlier. They did what Marcus asked after I explained the situation, his voice rising in indignation. And they still expect you to pay their bills. That's the arrangement we've had, I said, realizing how bizarre it sounded when voiced aloud. Fabian, that's not an arrangement. That's exploitation, Marcus replied. You're not a difficult person, you're thoughtful and generous to a fault. They're using you as an ATM while treating you like an unwelcome guest. His words resonated with what Dr. Goldstein had been telling me for years, but that I'd been reluctant to accept. What would you do? I asked. I'd stop enabling them, he said without hesitation. Money is the only language they seem to understand, so speak it, but get legal advice first. After our call, I remembered other instances of financial manipulation. My mother borrowing $5,000 for landscaping that somehow became $7,000 with no explanation. My father asking for help with Heather's college tuition despite her mediocre grades. The vacation home renovation that doubled in cost after I'd agreed to fund it. Each time I'd expressed mild concern only to be labeled stingy or controlling for wanting accountability for my own money. The next morning, I contacted Franklin Hayes, my corporate attorney, explaining the situation in strictly financial terms. His advice was straightforward. You have no legal obligation to continue these payments. Ensure all cancellations are properly documented, particularly the mortgage notice. If there are joint accounts, separate them immediately. I spent my lunch break researching alternative Thanksgiving plans. I found a community dinner for finance professionals who couldn't travel home organized by my firm's cultural committee. I also booked an emergency session with Dr. Goldstein for that evening. This feels like a significant boundary you're setting, she observed after I outlined my plan. It's healthy, but prepare yourself for significant pushback. People who have grown accustomed to controlling others rarely relinquish that control without a fight. Her words proved prescient as I began methodically organizing what needed to be done. I created a checklist in my characteristic thorough style. 1. Notify mortgage company of payment cessation. 2. Remove name from utility accounts. 3. Cancel supplemental credit cards. 4. Document all communications. 5. Prepare clear terms for potential reconciliation. With the plan laid out, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and resolution. This wasn't an act of vengeance, but a necessary severing of unhealthy ties. I wasn't cutting my family off permanently. I was creating space for a healthier relationship to potentially form. That evening, I made one last attempt at communication, sending a carefully worded email to all 3 family members. I've been reflecting on our family dynamic, particularly the recent decision to exclude me from Thanksgiving while expecting financial support to continue. This has made me realize that our relationship has become unbalanced and unhealthy. I need time to reassess my role in the family and the boundaries I've failed to maintain. I'll be making changes to our financial arrangements that reflect this reassessment. I'm open to discussion about building a more respectful relationship moving forward. The responses came quickly and predictably. My mother replied with a single line. This is exactly the difficult behavior we were trying to avoid at Thanksgiving. My father sent a longer message about family loyalty and obligations. Heather accused me of throwing a tantrum because I couldn't handle not being the center of attention for once. Not one of them acknowledged the fundamental issue that they had excluded me while expecting my financial support to continue. Their responses solidified my resolve. This wasn't about money, it was about respect. And respect, I was finally learning, couldn't be purchased. With clarity of purpose, I turned back to my laptop and began executing my plan. The process of disentangling myself financially from my family began the next morning. I woke before dawn, the weight of what I was about to do, settling heavily on my shoulders. This wasn't an impulsive reaction. It was a deliberate choice to establish boundaries that should have existed years ago. My first call was to Northeast Mortgage Services, which held my parents' home loan. I'd been making payments directly from my account for nearly 7 years, ever since my father claimed a temporary cash flow problem that somehow never resolved itself. "Good morning. This is Fabian Reynolds," I said when the customer service representative answered. "I need to discuss an account for which I've been making payments, but where I'm not the named borrower." The representative, a woman named Amelia, was professional and discreet. "What changes would you like to make to the payment arrangement, Mr. Reynolds?" "I need to cease all automatic payments effective immediately," I explained. "The mortgage holders should be notified that they'll need to resume responsibility for their own payments." Amelia asked several verification questions, then confirmed, "I've noted in the system that automatic payments from your account will stop immediately. The account holders will be notified that their next payment of $3,250 is due on the 1st of next month." The simplicity of the transaction was almost anticlimactic. 7 years of financial obligation ended with a 10-minute phone call. Next came the utilities. I'd put the gas, electric, water, and internet services in my name when my parents' credit had been insufficient to maintain services without a large deposit. I called each provider in succession, explaining that I was removing myself from the accounts. "The current residents will need to establish new service in their own names," I told the electric company representative. "Please ensure they're notified that service will be disconnected in 7 days unless new payment arrangements are made." I requested the same 7-day grace period from each utility, giving my parents a reasonable window to make new arrangements. I wasn't trying to leave them literally in the dark. I was forcing them to take responsibility for their own basic living expenses. The credit cards required a different approach. I logged into my online banking portal and navigated to the supplemental card section. There I found the cards issued to my mother, father, and surprisingly one for Heather that I didn't recall authorizing. With 3 decisive clicks, I canceled all supplemental cards, then called the fraud department to ensure no new charges could be processed. "I'd like to be notified of any attempts to use these canceled cards," I requested, knowing my family might test whether I was serious. By noon, I had systematically removed myself as the financial foundation of my family's lifestyle. The process was exhausting, not physically, but emotionally. Each cancellation felt like cutting a cord that had bound me to a dysfunctional dynamic for decades. I took a walk along Boston Harbor during my lunch break, watching the cold November waves crash against the shore. The city was gearing up for Thanksgiving with storefronts displaying autumn decorations and restaurants advertising holiday specials. Families strolled along the waterfront, children bundled in colorful scarves, parents holding hands. I wondered what it would be like to be part of a family that genuinely wanted your presence. Not just your presence. When I returned to my apartment, I had 12 missed calls. 5 from my mother, 4 from my father, 3 from Heather. I wasn't ready to speak with them yet. This boundary needed to be firm from the outset. Answering their calls immediately would only reinforce the pattern of me being available whenever they needed something. Instead, I continued with the final steps of my plan. I withdrew $5,000 in cash and placed it in my safe emergency money in case my family faced genuine hardship while adjusting to their new financial reality. I wasn't cruel. I simply needed them to understand that my support came with the basic expectation of respect. I then drafted an email to my family attorney, documenting the steps I'd taken and clarifying that I was not abandoning financial responsibility out of spite, but establishing boundaries after years of one-sided support. Legal documentation felt excessive, but Dr. Goldstein had warned me that family financial entanglements often turned litigious when challenged. As evening fell, my phone continued to buzz with texts and calls. I glanced at the messages without responding. "Mother, the credit card was declined at the grocery store. Fix this immediately. Father, your mother is very upset. Call us right away. Heather, what the hell, Fabian mom is crying in the middle of Whole Foods because her card was declined. Real mature." Their tone was accusatory, demanding with no acknowledgement of the connection between their treatment of me and this consequence. It only confirmed that I'd made the right decision. That night, I experienced a strange mixture of guilt and liberation. I made myself a simple dinner of pasta, with garlic and olive oil, opened a bottle of Cabernet I'd been saving, and allowed myself to really feel everything. I'd been suppressing the hurt of being excluded, the frustration of being taken for granted, the anger at being simultaneously exploited and rejected. As I sipped my wine, I remembered a conversation with my therapist months earlier. Financial support without emotional reciprocity isn't generosity, Dr. Goldstein had said. It's a transaction where you're paying for approval you'll never receive. She was right. I'd been buying the illusion of family bonds, not building real ones. Before going to bed, I made one final preparation for the storm I knew was coming. I wrote out clear terms for what a healthier relationship would look like. Mutual respect, acknowledgement of my contributions, boundaries around financial support, and, most importantly, an end to the difficult label that had been used to dismiss my feelings and needs for decades. I slept surprisingly well that night. The weight of unspoken resentments finally lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I'd acted in my own best interest, not as the family bank, but as a person deserving of basic respect. The next morning was Thanksgiving Eve. I knew the real fallout was about to begin. The first call came at 6:43 in the morning on Thanksgiving Eve. My father, his voice uncharacteristically urgent when I finally answered. "Fabian, what's going on? Your mother tried to buy groceries for tomorrow and her card was declined." Then we got notices from all the utility companies about service transfers. "Is something wrong with your accounts?" The controlled panic in his tone made it clear this was the first time he'd considered that their financial security might not be as solid as they'd assumed. I took a deep breath before responding, determined to remain calm and clear. "Nothing's wrong with my accounts, Dad. I've made a decision to stop covering family expenses effective immediately." There was a long pause. Then, "Is this about Thanksgiving? Your mother didn't mean—" "It's about more than Thanksgiving," I interrupted, surprising both of us with my assertiveness. "It's about years of being treated as a financial resource while being emotionally excluded from the family." The Thanksgiving uninvitation was simply the clearest example of a pattern that's existed for years. "But we can't make the mortgage payment without you," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper, as though admitting a shameful secret. "We're not prepared for this." "I know," I replied. "That's the problem. You've become dependent on me financially while treating me as though my presence is barely tolerable. That dynamic needs to change." The call ended with my father promising to talk to your mother and figure something out. His tone suggested he still expected this to blow over, that I would eventually relent, as I always had before. My mother's voicemails began 30 minutes later, escalating in intensity, with each new message. "First, Fabian, call me back immediately. There's some problem with the credit cards. Second, this is childish behavior even for you. Fix the accounts now. Third, we need to buy a 20-pound turkey and all the fixings for tomorrow. This is completely irresponsible. Fourth, the mortgage company called about a missed payment. What did you do, fifth? If this is about Thanksgiving, you're proving exactly why we didn't want you here. So difficult, so dramatic." The last message was particularly revealing. Even faced with the consequences of their actions, my mother still framed me as the problem. The difficult label was so deeply ingrained that she couldn't see beyond it even when confronted with its impact. I listened to each message without returning the calls, noting how none contained an apology or acknowledgement of how I might feel about being excluded from the holiday. Instead, they focused exclusively on the practical inconvenience of suddenly having to pay their own bills. My sister's messages were equally telling. "Mom is freaking out at the grocery store. Fix whatever you did. This tantrum is exactly why you weren't invited tomorrow. Grow up. I can't believe you'd ruin our Thanksgiving over your hurt feelings." By mid-morning, I turned my phone to silent and focused on preparing for my alternative Thanksgiving plans. I decided to attend the community dinner at my firm, then spend the evening with Marcus and his partner, who had kindly invited me when they heard about my family situation. I spent the day cooking the apple pie I'd promised to bring to Marcus's dinner, finding unexpected peace in the simple act of measuring ingredients and rolling dough. There was something therapeutic about creating something wholesome from scratch, perhaps a metaphor for the new boundaries I was establishing. Around 3 o'clock, I checked my phone again. 27 missed calls and 43 text messages. I scrolled through them quickly, noting a slight shift in tone in the most recent ones. Father, the mortgage company says we're late on the last 2 payments. Have you been having financial problems you haven't told us about? This message revealed another layer of my family's disconnection. They hadn't even considered that I might have been stretching myself thin to support them. Their assumption was that if payments were missed, it must be because I had financial problems, not because I'd chosen to stop enabling their behavior. Mother, we can't even buy food for dinner tonight, let alone for tomorrow. Is that what you wanted? To know we're going hungry? The emotional manipulation was transparent. They had retirement income and savings, perhaps not enough for the lifestyle they'd grown accustomed to with my support, but certainly enough to avoid going hungry. As evening approached, I drove to Marcus's home in Brookline, my freshly baked apple pie carefully secured on the passenger seat. His townhouse was warm and inviting, decorated with tasteful Thanksgiving touches. A stark contrast to the tense, critical atmosphere that had characterized my family holidays. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked, as he took my coat. "Better than expected," I admitted. There's guilt, but also a strange sense of relief. His partner, Daniel, handed me a glass of mulled cider. From what Marcus has told me, this boundary was long overdue. The evening that followed was revelatory. We ate a delicious meal without anyone criticizing the seasoning. We discussed politics, literature, and our careers, without undercutting remarks or comparisons. When I mentioned a recent promotion, they both congratulated me sincerely. No one changed the subject or minimized my achievement. This, I realized, was what healthy relationships felt like. Mutual respect, genuine interest, celebration of successes. The contrast with my family dynamic was stark and enlightening. Around 9 o'clock, as we were enjoying dessert, my phone rang again. My father's name appeared on the screen. Something about the timing him calling during what would have been our traditional family dessert hour made me decide to answer. "Hello, Dad." His voice sounded different, subdued, perhaps even reflective. "Fabian, I've been thinking about what you said this morning, about being treated as a financial resource, but not really as part of the family." I waited, not filling the silence as I typically would have. "I think," he hesitated, "I think there might be some truth to that. We've taken your support for granted, and your mother, well, she has a certain way of seeing things." It was the closest he'd ever come to acknowledging the dysfunctional dynamic. "The mortgage company says we've missed the last 2 payments," he continued. Did you stop paying earlier than yesterday?" "No," I replied. "I've never missed a payment. If they're saying payments were missed, you should check with them directly." There was a long pause before he said, "I see. So your mother has been. There's been some misrepresentation about our financial situation." The implication was clear. My mother had been telling me payments were needed when they weren't, possibly diverting the funds elsewhere. It was a revelation that should have angered me, but instead just confirmed what I already suspected. The exploitation ran deeper than I knew. "We need to have a real conversation," I said finally. "Not over the phone, and not just about money, about respect and what family actually means." "Yes," he agreed, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of determination. "Yes, I think we do." After we hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, processing the small but significant shift that had occurred. For perhaps the first time, my father had seen the situation clearly, and acknowledged it without immediately deferring to my mother's perspective. It was a small crack in a dysfunctional system that had been solidifying for decades. Whether it would widen into real change remained to be seen, but it was more progress than I'd experienced in years of funding their lifestyle while accepting their emotional scraps. As I drove home that night, I felt a strange sense of gratitude for the Thanksgiving uninvitation that had finally pushed me to action. Sometimes the most painful exclusions create space for the most necessary growth. My phone buzzed with a new text as I pulled into my parking garage. It was from my mother. "We need to talk tomorrow. This has gone far enough." Her message contained no apology, no acknowledgement, just the expectation that she could dictate when enough was enough. But for once, That determination wasn't hers to make. The conversation would happen on mutual terms, or not at all. I entered my apartment oddly at peace despite the turmoil. Tomorrow would bring more confrontation, but tonight I had experienced something invaluable, a genuine connection with people who appreciated my presence, not just my financial contributions. That I realized was something to be truly thankful for. Thanksgiving Day dawned cold and clear in Boston. I woke early, made coffee, and stood at my window watching the sun rise over the harbor. There was something symbolic about facing this confrontation on Thanksgiving itself, a holiday meant to celebrate gratitude and family bonds, neither of which had been authentically present in my relationship with my parents and sister. My phone rang at 9:15, my mother right on schedule. Her voice when I answered was tight with controlled fury. "We need to meet today and sort this out," she said without preamble. "This little financial tantrum has made your point." I took a slow breath. "I'm not available today, Mother. I have plans." What could possibly be more important than fixing this mess you've created? The incredulity in her voice was genuine. She truly couldn't conceive that I would prioritize anything over responding to her demands. "I've made commitments to friends," I replied calmly. "I'm available tomorrow morning. We can meet at the Riverdale coffee shop at 10. The neutral location was deliberate. This conversation wouldn't happen on their territory, where old dynamics could easily reassert themselves. Tomorrow. But what are we supposed to do about Thanksgiving dinner? Heather and Jason are expecting. "I imagine you'll manage," I interrupted, surprising myself with my firmness. After all, I'm too difficult to have at the dinner table, but apparently not too difficult to fund it. "You'll need to decide which is true." She started to respond, but I continued. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Riverdale coffee shop. I'll be there for 1 hour. If you want to discuss rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms, that's when and where it will happen." I ended the call before she could object further, my heart pounding, but my resolve steady. Setting and maintaining boundaries didn't come naturally after decades of capitulation, but each small act of self-respect made the next one easier. The calls and texts continued throughout the morning, my father pleading, my mother demanding, Heather alternating between anger and attempts at guilt. I silenced my phone and focused on preparing for the community Thanksgiving event at my firm. The company gathering was refreshingly straightforward. Good food, pleasant conversation with colleagues who knew me for my work rather than family-assigned labels, and none of the undercurrents of criticism I'd grown accustomed to at family gatherings. I found myself laughing genuinely, the tension in my shoulders gradually easing as the afternoon progressed. By evening, when I checked my phone again, the tone of the messages had shifted. My father's texts had become more reflective, less panicked. "Your mother and I have been talking. There are things we need to acknowledge. Please meet with us tomorrow." Even my mother's messages showed a slight change. "We had sandwiches for Thanksgiving dinner. Jason was very understanding. Perhaps we all need to reconsider certain decisions." It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission of impact, the first step toward accountability. The next morning, I arrived at Riverdale coffee shop 15 minutes early, selecting a table in the corner that offered both privacy and a clear view of the entrance. I ordered a black coffee and waited, mentally rehearsing the points I needed to make clear. My parents arrived precisely at 10, my father holding the door for my mother, in a gesture that seemed both habitual and symbolic of their relationship dynamic. They spotted me and navigated through the morning crowd, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and determination. "Fabian," my mother said, as they sat down, her voice tight, but controlled. "This has gone on long enough." "Hello, Mother." "Dad," I replied evenly. "I agree that things have gone on too long, about 7 years too long by my calculation." My father glanced between us, then spoke before my mother could respond. "We had a difficult night thinking about what you said, about being treated as a financial resource rather than a family member. We may have taken your support for granted." My mother's lips thinned, but surprisingly, she didn't contradict him. Instead, she said, "We've become accustomed to a certain arrangement. It's disruptive to have it changed so abruptly." "The arrangement was changed abruptly when you uninvited me from Thanksgiving, but expected my financial support to continue," I pointed out. "That made the imbalance impossible to ignore any longer." You've always been sensitive. She began falling back on her familiar narrative. No, Mother. I've always been treated as though my feelings matter less than everyone else's convenience. There's a difference. The clarity in my voice seemed to catch her off guard. I'm not sensitive. I'm a person with reasonable expectations of reciprocity in relationships. My father shifted uncomfortably. The mortgage company confirmed what you said. All payments have been made on time. Your mother had told me. Well, there's been some confusion about our financial situation. The careful phrasing was telling he was acknowledging my mother's deception without directly confronting her. Even now he was walking the fine line of placating her while trying to rebuild trust with me. Let me be clear about my position, I said, taking out a folder I'd prepared with financial records. I've supported this family financially for 7 years, covering approximately $7,500 in monthly expenses. During that time, I've been consistently treated as an unwelcome presence, criticized for personality traits that are actually strengths in my professional life, and excluded from family events while still being expected to fund them. I slid the folder across the table. These are the exact amounts I've contributed over the years. The total is just over $630,000. My mother's eyes widened at the figure, perhaps, seeing for the first time the scale of what I'd provided. My father looked physically ill. I'm willing to rebuild a relationship with both of you, but it will be a relationship based on mutual respect, not financial dependence. I'm not cutting you off permanently, but I am establishing conditions for my support going forward. What conditions? My mother asked, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. First, family therapy, all of us, including Heather. Second, transparency about financial needs and where my contributions are going. Third, an end to the difficult label and other forms of emotional dismissal. I'm not difficult. I'm thoughtful, analytical, and unwilling to accept disrespect. My father nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. My mother looked like she wanted to object, but instead asked, and the mortgage, the utilities. I'll cover 50% of the mortgage for 3 months while you adjust your budget and explore refinancing options. After that, you'll need to handle it yourselves, or downsize. As for utilities, you'll need to establish service in your own names immediately. And if we refuse these conditions, my mother couldn't quite keep the challenge from her voice. Then you'll be making the same choice you made when you uninvited me from Thanksgiving, deciding that my presence and boundaries are less valuable than what I can provide financially. The difference is that now those two things come together, or not at all. We talked for another 40 minutes, working through practical details and setting a date for the first family therapy session. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was perhaps the most honest exchange we'd ever had. As we prepared to leave, my mother hesitated, then said something I never thought I'd hear. I may have been harsh in my assessment of your personality over the years. Coming from her, it was the closest thing to an apology I could expect at this stage. I nodded, accepting it for what it was, a small step toward recognition, if not yet full respect. My sister called that afternoon her approach a mixture of indignation and negotiation. So, you're holding Mom and Dad's house hostage unless we all admit you're perfect, she began. No, Heather. I'm saying that my financial support comes with the basic expectation of being treated with respect, not labeled difficult, for having normal human needs and boundaries. She was quiet for a moment. The family therapy thing, is that really necessary? Yes, I said simply. It's the only way forward if you want me involved in the family in any capacity. Fine, she sighed. But don't expect some magical transformation. Mom is still Mom. I don't expect magic, I replied. I expect effort and basic respect. The same things I've been giving for years without receiving in return. After we hung up, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Hope that real change might be possible. Skepticism born from years of disappointment. And a new, unfamiliar sense of self-worth that came from finally advocating for myself. The following week, I arranged a meeting with a financial advisor for my parents, offering to pay for the consultation as a good faith gesture. I also scheduled our first family therapy session with Dr. Rachel Winters, a specialist in family systems who came highly recommended for cases involving financial codependence. When I met with my parents to review their actual financial situation, the meeting was revelatory. My mother had been operating under the assumption that my support would continue indefinitely making financial decisions that reflected that expectation. My father had been largely excluded from financial planning, deferring to my mother as he always had. Together with the advisor, we created a realistic budget that would allow them to live comfortably within their actual means, which, while not lavish, were certainly adequate. The process was uncomfortable but necessary, peeling back layers of entitlement and dependency that had accumulated over years. "I never realized how much we'd come to rely on your contributions," my father admitted as we reviewed the figures. "It wasn't fair to you." My mother was less forthcoming, but participated in the process, her resistance gradually giving way to pragmatic acceptance of their new reality. The first therapy session was even more challenging. Dr. Winters skillfully guided us through an exploration of family patterns, exposing how the difficult label had been used to maintain control and justify unfair treatment. Heather was defensive, initially reluctant to acknowledge her role in the dynamic, but even she couldn't deny the evidence when Dr. Winters had us list specific instances of exclusion alongside financial expectations. It appears Dr. Winters observed that Fabian's emotional needs have been consistently subordinated to everyone else's, while his financial contributions have been not just accepted, but expected. That creates a profound imbalance that would damage any relationship. My mother shifted uncomfortably. "We never asked him to pay for everything." Not explicitly, the therapist acknowledged, but implicitly, through the creation of emergencies, the gradual increase in dependency, and the withdrawal of emotional connection when he questioned financial requests. The session ended with homework. Each family member was to write down what they valued about the others, separate from practical or financial contributions. It was a simple exercise that proved surprisingly difficult for my parents and sister when it came to me. In our second session 2 weeks later, they shared their lists. My father mentioned my reliability and intelligence. My mother noted my organizational skills and work ethic. Heather acknowledged my generosity. What was striking was how functional their assessments were, focused on what I did rather than who I was. When I shared my lists for them, I included personal qualities: my father's patience, my mother's determination, my sister's creativity. The contrast highlighted how they had come to see me primarily as a resource, rather than a person with inherent worth beyond what I could provide. This, Dr. Winters said, is where the healing begins, recognizing each other's intrinsic value, not just their utility in our lives. It was the beginning of a long, sometimes painful process of reconstruction. There were setbacks, my mother reverting to old patterns. When stressed, my sister occasionally testing boundaries, my father slipping into passivity rather than engaging directly. But there was also progress, small but meaningful shifts in how we communicated and the expectations we held of each other. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, I received an unexpected email from Jason, my sister's boyfriend, the pediatric surgeon, whose first impression had supposedly been so important that it justified my exclusion from the holiday. "I wanted to reach out and introduce myself properly," he wrote. "Heather has shared some of the family situation, and I respect the boundaries you've established. For what it's worth, I would have enjoyed meeting you at Thanksgiving and hope to have that opportunity in the future under better circumstances." His message confirmed what I had suspected. The concern about his first impression had been my mother's creation, not a reflection of reality. It was another small validation of the changes I was making. By Christmas, the transformation was still very much in progress, but the dynamic had shifted noticeably. I was invited to the holiday gathering explicitly and warmly. My financial support had been reduced to helping with specific transparent needs rather than open-ended subsidies. Most importantly, when I expressed an opinion that differed from my mother's, it was heard and considered rather than dismissed as me being difficult. The path forward wasn't perfectly smooth, but it was at least headed in the right direction toward relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency disguised as family obligation. As winter gave way to spring, the transformation in my family relationships continued, not in dramatic leaps, but in small, meaningful steps that gradually accumulated into real change. The family therapy sessions with Dr. Winters became a cornerstone of our new dynamic, providing a structured space where old patterns could be identified and new ones practiced. Family systems don't change overnight. Dr. Winters reminded us during our 6th session. The patterns you're working to change were established over decades. Give yourselves credit for each small shift in the right direction. Those shifts were becoming more noticeable. My mother had begun catching herself mid-criticism sometimes, even acknowledging when she was falling into old habits. "I'm doing it again, aren't I?" she'd say. The self-awareness itself, a remarkable development. She wasn't transformed her controlling tendencies, remained part of her personality, but she was learning to recognize when they crossed the line into harmful behavior. My father's evolution was perhaps the most striking. Freed from the constant financial pressure and encouraged by Dr. Winters to express his own thoughts, he gradually straightened from the stooped posture of perpetual conciliation. During our April session, when my mother began to dismiss one of my suggestions about their retirement planning, he gently but firmly intervened. "Margaret, let's hear Fabian out. His financial expertise has served us well, and more importantly, he's offering his perspective, not imposing it." The room fell silent for a moment, all of us processing this small but significant assertion. My mother looked surprised, but didn't object. I felt a surge of appreciation for his growth, and a bittersweet wonder about how different our family might have been if he'd found this voice decades earlier. The financial aspect of our relationship had been completely restructured. Instead of the open-ended support I'd provided before we'd established clear parameters, I helped my parents create a sustainable budget based on their actual income and reasonable lifestyle adjustments. They downsized from the 4-bedroom colonial to a comfortable 2-bedroom condominium that better suited their needs and financial reality. The mortgage was now manageable on their own, though I had contributed to the down payment as a one-time gift, freely given, not extracted, through guilt or obligation. For special circumstances like medical expenses not covered by insurance, we'd set up a transparent process. They would present the need with documentation, we would discuss options together, and any assistance I provided would be clearly defined and acknowledged. The key difference was that my contribution was now a choice made in the context of mutual respect, not an expectation imposed through emotional manipulation. Heather's relationship with me had been the slowest to evolve. Her position as the golden child had been comfortable, and the redistribution of family roles threatened that comfort. But even she was making progress, particularly after a breakthrough session where she acknowledged how she had benefited from the unbalanced family system. I didn't really see it before she admitted how I could just ask for things and they would appear, how Mom would praise me for the smallest achievements while dismissing Fabian's major ones. It was nice being the favorite, but it wasn't fair. And it didn't actually prepare me well for the real world. That confession opened the door to a more authentic relationship between us. We began meeting for coffee every few weeks, gradually getting to know each other as adults rather than as competitors in a dysfunctional family system. I discovered she had a sharp wit I'd never appreciated before, and she began to value my analytical approach to problems rather than dismissing it as me being intense. The real test came as the next Thanksgiving approached. Would the changes we'd made withstand the pressure of holiday expectations and ingrained patterns? 2 weeks before the holiday, my mother called. I still felt a reflexive tension when her name appeared on my phone. A Pavlovian response to years of criticism, but I answered with an open mind. "Fabian," she began, her voice carrying an unfamiliar note of hesitation. "I'm planning Thanksgiving dinner and I wanted to specifically invite you. Not just as an afterthought, but as an important part of our family gathering." The explicit acknowledgement of last year's exclusion hung in the air between us. "We thought we might try something different this year," she continued, when I didn't immediately respond. "Instead of me doing all the cooking and planning, what if we each contribute something we're good at? I know you make that apple pie that Marcus raves about." It was a small gesture, but a meaningful one. An invitation not just to be present, but to contribute in a way that recognized my individual skills and preferences. "I'd like that," I said simply. "Good," she replied, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "And Fabian, I've been reflecting on something Dr. Winters said about how labels can become self-fulfilling prophecies. I want you to know that I'm trying to see you clearly now, not through the lens of old assumptions." It wasn't quite an apology for years of calling me difficult, but it was an acknowledgement that the label had been harmful and largely unfair. Coming from my mother, it represented significant growth. Thanksgiving Day arrived crisp and clear, with just enough chill in the air to make the warmth of my parents' new condominium feel welcoming. I brought not only my apple pie, but also a bottle of the same wine I'd been drinking alone a year earlier, when I'd made the decision to stop enabling the family dynamic. It seemed fitting to transform it from a symbol of isolation to one of connection. The gathering was smaller than in previous years, just my parents, Heather, Jason, and me. The absence of extended family members, who often amplified the old patterns, helped create space for our new, still fragile dynamic to breathe. Dinner wasn't perfect. There were moments of tension, brief reversions to familiar scripts. My mother couldn't entirely resist a few comments about the way I'd carved the turkey. Heather momentarily fell into the old habit of interrupting me mid-story. But the difference was in how these moments were handled with awareness, course corrections, and sometimes even humor. "Sorry, old habit," Heather said, after cutting me off, then genuinely added, "Please continue. I want to hear the rest." After dinner, as we sat with coffee and dessert, my father raised his glass in an impromptu toast. "To growth," he said simply, and to Fabian, who had the courage to demand better from all of us, including himself. My mother and sister echoed the toast, and I felt an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the wine, and everything to do with finally being seen and valued for who I was, not what I could provide. Later that evening, as Jason helped me carry leftovers to my car, he commented, "Heather told me about last Thanksgiving and everything that followed. It's pretty remarkable how much has changed in a year." "It's still a work in progress," I acknowledged. "All families are," he replied, with the insight of someone who'd seen countless family dynamics in his pediatric practice. "But the difference is whether they're progressing or stagnating. Yours is definitely progressing." As I drove back to my apartment that night, I reflected on the journey of the past year. The uninvitation that had initially felt like such a painful rejection had ultimately been the catalyst for necessary change. By withdrawing the financial support that had enabled the dysfunctional dynamic, I had created space for a healthier relationship to potentially form. And somewhat to my surprise, that potential was gradually being realized. I still had moments of doubt and residual hurt. There were still times when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But I had learned perhaps the most valuable lesson of my adult life, that real relationships must be built on mutual respect and reciprocity, not on transactions disguised as family obligation. The labels that had defined me for so long, difficult, intense, overly analytical, had been revealed for what they truly were: attempts to control and dismiss authentic parts of myself that didn't conform to others' expectations. In reclaiming those parts, I had found not only self-respect, but also unexpectedly, a path to more genuine connection with my family. The journey wasn't over, but it had undeniably begun. And that beginning, with all its challenges and imperfections, was something to be truly thankful for. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who took your support for granted? What was the hardest part about standing up for yourself? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if my story resonated with you. Remember, sometimes the most painful moments become the catalysts for necessary change. Thank you for listening, and I wish you strength and clarity in your own family journeys.